I can't take it anymore. Please, let's get a divorce. I whispered as I pressed my head against the cold floor. It had been 15 years since our son was born and I started working at my in-laws' factory. Because of being family, I never received any salary and endured being treated like a housemaid. My father-in-law refuses to change his ways, and my mother-in-law constantly interferes with how the employees are treated. And instead of putting a stop to it, my husband blindly believes that everything his parents do is right. When I returned home, there was no help with childcare or household chores. Since being tied to my in-laws' house, I wasn't even allowed to visit my own family. But if that were the only issue, I could still bear it. I could endure it if it were just me. But I couldn't forgive sacrificing my son. My husband didn't even bother to ask our son, who would soon graduate from high school, about his wishes. He simply proposed making him work at the factory. My husband's argument was that, like himself, our son, as the heir, should start working at the factory early. But our son didn't want any of that. Was this man not only exploiting me but also aiming to exploit our son's life? When that thought crossed my mind, my patience reached its limit. My husband looked down at me coldly as he sipped his hot coffee while I resolved to bring up the divorce.
Divorce, huh? Fine by me, but you still need to work at the factory after that.
My name is Elizabeth, and I'm turning 45 this year. Influenced by my father, who was an engineer, I had a fondness for tinkering with machines from a young age. I pursued studies in electronics engineering at a technical school. After starting my career, I met my current husband, Tony, at a meeting with a client. During discussions about ordering parts from the town factory owned by my husband's father, Tony and I hit it off as I continued to visit the factory for meetings. Tony confessed his feelings to me, and we began dating with marriage in mind. Back in those days, when it was still very much a male-dominated society, especially in the field of technology, I had assumed that being a female engineer at a client company wouldn't leave a good impression. However, contrary to my expectations, his parents welcomed our relationship with smiles. Although I had pride in acquiring top-notch technical skills while working as a temporary employee at various companies, I was quite inexperienced in matters of love. So, when his parents accepted me, I remember feeling truly relieved. That was when I found out I was pregnant. Several months after getting married, when my period didn't come and I went to the hospital, it turned out I was pregnant. When I told my husband, he was so flustered that he spit out the coffee he was drinking, then jumped up with joy. It was like a festival. Pregnancy prompted me to resign from the job I had until then, and without any doubt, I nodded in agreement to my husband's suggestion that I should work at my in-laws' factory once the child was born. Nowadays, it may not be necessary to accept quitting work upon marriage, but at that time, it wasn't uncommon for women to leave their jobs and move into their husband's family home after getting married. Additionally, I indeed had the desire to support the family as a member of my husband's family. We quickly tidied up the detached house at my in-laws' place and began living as a family of 3, including our son in my belly, without any interference. However, it wasn't until I gave birth to our son that I finally realized something. My husband didn't help with any household chores. Even though I became a full-time housewife, managing all the household tasks while caring for a young child turned out to be much more challenging than I had imagined. Even when our son cries, my husband doesn't comfort him, and when I'm changing diapers, he just complains, asking if dinner or bath time is ready. Even when I beg him to help a little, he dismisses it, insisting that household chores and childcare are women's duties. He, unemployed as he is, starts yelling that I should just do it. Occasionally, when my in-laws come to check on us, I seek their help, but all they do is coo over our son, saying how cute he is, without actually helping to change diapers or soothe him. On top of that, my father-in-law took away the savings I had accumulated from working before marriage, claiming that a wife's savings belong to the family. In this household controlled by my father-in-law, there's no way I can appeal for my money back. While my in-laws thankfully covered expenses like rent, utilities, and groceries, I had no money of my own to spend freely. Even for buying a single piece of clothing for our child, I had to beg my husband for pocket money. I gradually lost the will to resist them. Instead of being the support I needed, my husband either treated me coldly, as if it were solely my duty as a wife, or threw terrible tantrums when he was in a bad mood. Holding our newborn son, I found myself trapped in this situation with no way to escape. My in-laws and husband told me to work as a family employee without pay, as soon as they realized that my son John could attend daycare and I would have some time to myself. There were times when I pleaded to at least receive some salary, as I wanted to buy new clothes for my child, but both my husband and parents-in-law used the fact that they covered our living expenses as a shield and adamantly refused. They insisted that the hand-me-down clothes from relatives, even if stained, were enough. How many times did I hold my son close, begging for forgiveness as a mother who couldn't even afford to buy him new clothes? Before I knew it, my son John became the sole purpose of my life. Neither my in-laws nor my husband offered any help with childcare. With no means of contacting my own family or affording transportation to rely on, I felt utterly powerless. All I could do was to protect my son John from this demonic family and raise him to be a fine person. That became my sole goal, and I worked tirelessly, pouring my heart and soul into it. It was in the spring when John turned 15 years old. Suddenly, my husband and in-laws decided to renovate the family house. They insisted that I should help as a member of the family, yet they refused to pay me a salary. I couldn't help but wonder if they truly had the financial means for house renovations. If they had that kind of money, why couldn't they have used it to buy better clothes for John? Why couldn't they have provided him with better food? I couldn't shake off the image of my son's face, having experienced poverty since he was young. Why the sudden renovation? I timidly asked, to which my husband snorted dismissively.
Well, John is turning 15, right? He'll be able to work from next year. It's about time he starts living with my parents, learning the family business as the successor.
Without even considering John's wishes, my husband implicitly stated that he wouldn't allow him to go to university. I could feel my face turn pale at his words. If it were just me, I could endure it a bit longer. But was this man trying to control John's life as well? The moment I had that thought, I found myself blurting out divorce without even thinking. I can't do this anymore. Please divorce me. My husband, maintaining a blank expression, looked down at me for several tens of seconds, then let out an exaggeratedly loud sigh.
Divorce, divorce,
he said, sipping his coffee with a deliberate pause. Then, to my shock, he said something unbelievable.
Sure, we can get divorced, but you'll still have to work here. There's nowhere else that would hire you anyway, right?
The world seemed to sway for a moment. What was this man going to say next? To suggest that I should work in his factory even after divorce. It was absurd. I looked up at my husband, taken aback, only to see him grinning at me with a smug expression. No way. I can work perfectly well elsewhere. Fortunately, There were still business connections between our factory and my previous workplace, and I had former colleagues who had advanced in their careers there. While I might not be able to work for the same company, with my skills, I should be able to get a job through referrals.
Well, whatever, but leave John here. He's the heir to this place.
My husband seemed to back down under my resolute refusal, but now he began insisting that I should leave John behind. I wanted to scream at him for saying something so foolish, but what if John wanted to stay here? If I left my in-laws' house, John might end up living a more difficult life than he does now. Unlike me, if John were raised as the heir, he might be able to live without any inconvenience. Such thoughts crossed my mind. Biting my lip, my husband led John and me to the living room of my in-laws' house. Sensing the uneasy atmosphere, John, perhaps understanding something was wrong, followed silently.
What's going on at this hour, Tony?
My father-in-law, Eric, greeted us with a puzzled expression.
She wants a divorce.
My husband declared, in a somewhat joking tone. Upon hearing those words, I could tell that John, who was following behind us, gasped in surprise. When my father-in-law gave us a once-over with a critical eye, he patted his ample belly and silently led us into the living room. Perhaps Judy, my mother-in-law, had also heard, because she glared at me and quietly brewed some tea. It had become a routine that nothing was placed in front of me. When did it start? I usually brewed my own without a fuss, but today, I just couldn't bring myself to do so.
So, why did Beth suddenly start talking about divorce?
Father-in-law asked my husband while sipping his hot tea. Somehow, my father-in-law had started calling me by a nickname. When I was called by that nickname for the first time, I thought it might have been a mishearing, but it wasn't. Neither my mother-in-law nor my husband even cared about it. Oh, how many times I've told myself that this is the norm for this family. Father-in-law's intrusive gaze made me uncomfortable, and I always felt like averting my eyes, but today I held back and looked back straight at him.
She brought up the topic as soon as we started talking about renovations. She must really hate the idea of living with you.
My husband spat out these words, and both my in-laws directed sharp, needle-like gazes at me. I knew it was coming, but I never seemed to get used to it. The initial atmosphere of welcome faded away almost as soon as I started working at our factory. The first time I expressed an opinion about the production line at the factory, my father-in-law erupted in fury, insisting that his way was the best. But what seemed to bother him even more was that I didn't give up on suggesting improvements and insisted on making good products. My opinion, dismissed as just a woman's interference, led to a period of harassment from my father-in-law. Looking back, it might have been from around that time when I started receiving rough treatment from my in-laws. Although he's now retired, my father-in-law occasionally shows up at the factory, claiming to be a supervisor, just to check if things haven't changed his way. Employees always work nervously, fearing they might become targets. As for my mother-in-law, despite knowing nothing about the factory, she sometimes randomly interjects her opinions. The employee management is especially terrible. If they don't like someone's greeting, they'll cut their salary. If someone brings refreshments, they'll suggest giving them a bonus. They change employees' treatment based on their mood. Even after my husband became the CEO, this didn't change. He never questioned it, instead reflecting his parents' decisions. For my husband, if his parents say something is black, no matter how white it may be, it's black. I've been apologizing to them every day, knowing we couldn't survive if employees quit. But even that didn't please my in-laws or my husband. Please, I want a divorce, I said, without giving any reasons, bowing my head again. My hands trembled as they touched the floor, wondering how harsh the words thrown at me would be. However, contrary to my expectations, my father-in-law easily agreed.
If you insist, there's no helping it. Sometimes things just don't work out.
When I lifted my surprised face, he wore the same unpleasant smirk as my husband. A shiver ran down my spine.
Do as you please with the divorce. But I won't allow you to quit the factory. As compensation, you'll continue working for free as you have been.
What are they saying to me? Compensation? What does that even mean? What have I done to deserve being exploited by them like this? As I trembled nervously, my mother-in-law gently asked John.
John, you'll stay with us, won't you? Leaving with Elizabeth will only make you poor.
I panicked and looked at John. For me, it might have felt like walking on needles, but it wasn't necessarily a bad environment for John. He probably didn't know about my husband's intention to make him start working right after high school. Maybe John would choose to stay here after all. When John, who had been silent until then, finally spoke, I was so afraid that I involuntarily closed my eyes.
I'm going with Mom.
Without hesitation, he firmly declared his decision, and I looked up at John. He smiled kindly at me, despite my probably pathetic expression, and then turned his gaze sternly toward my in-laws and husband.
John, you're the heir to this family. I won't allow you to leave.
My husband shouted angrily.
John, please reconsider what you're saying.
John, who do you think raised you?
Seemingly shocked by John's determination, my mother-in-law hurriedly tried to persuade him, while my father-in-law, even more than my husband, turned red-faced and spat out his words in agitation. But John, as if protecting me, spoke up clearly once more.
It was Mom who raised me. I've never once thought of Dad, Grandpa, or Grandma who bullied Mom and never took care of her as family.
When did my son's back become so strong? The son I thought I had to protect is now protecting me. Despite feeling pathetic, I couldn't help but feel incredibly happy. It was a story I heard later from the family court mediator, but apparently, my husband and in-laws, panicking at the thought of losing their heir, consulted a lawyer acquaintance to see if there was any way out. However, unlike in the distant past, ultimately, the child's opinion takes precedence in such matters. Especially if a soon-to-be adult, like our 15-year-old son, has clearly chosen his mother, overturning that decision would be difficult. Reluctantly, my husband gave up custody of our son and begrudgingly agreed to asset division. However, when I requested payment for the wages I had earned while working for my in-laws all these years, they flatly refused, claiming I wasn't an employee and that I had been helping out of my own accord. After the discussion with my in-laws, the next day, I gathered a few belongings with my son and returned to my parents' home, where I hadn't been able to go for many years. My parents were surprised to see their daughter and their grandson, whom they hadn't seen since he was a child, suddenly return, but they welcomed us warmly without saying a word. I'm sorry I couldn't come back for so long.
What are you talking about? I'm sorry for not realizing sooner.
As soon as I explained the situation and apologized tearfully, my mother cried even more than I did and hugged me and John tightly. That evening's dinner overflowed with enthusiasm from my mother and father's homemade dishes, making it a peaceful time for me, a rare occurrence lately. The next day, the telephone in the living room of my parents' house rang loudly. It was my husband calling. I was about to hang up immediately, but I heard a sense of urgency in his voice mentioning employee, prompting me to listen intently. What's wrong? Was there an accident? The first thought that came to mind was an accident involving an employee. Perhaps someone got caught in machinery, or something happened during their commute.
Just come home as soon as possible. We'll talk about it then.
Without further explanation, I hurriedly headed to my in-laws' factory. The usually noisy factory, filled with the sounds of machinery, was oddly silent today. Puzzled, as I stood there, my husband and in-laws rushed towards me.
You're late. What were you doing?
Ignoring my father-in-law's complaints, I asked again, "What's going on? Was there an accident? Did someone get hurt?"
No, all the employees quit.
In my hurried inquiry, the unexpected words reached my ears. Did they quit? All of them? I repeated in disbelief. Such signs were nowhere to be seen yesterday. No, maybe one or two were already fed up with my father-in-law's unreasonable demands. Or was it my mother-in-law nagging again? Although there were some instances, it wasn't expected for all of them to quit suddenly. Seeing me bewildered, my husband spoke with a sense of bitterness.
It's because you left. As soon as they heard you were divorcing and leaving, they all quit.
As my husband stomped around in anger and shouted, I felt as if I were watching him from a distance, detached. Even after retiring, my father-in-law continues to interfere in the management and work processes, while my mother-in-law, upon noticing disliked employees, urges my husband to reduce their salaries. My husband takes their words seriously and reflects their attitudes in the management decisions. Due to their outrageous attitudes, employees have been growing increasingly dissatisfied year by year. It has been my role for the past 15 years to somehow intervene and mediate between them to prevent their anger from exploding. Within my reach, if any employee caught the attention of my father-in-law, I would defend them even if I was yelled at not to interfere as the daughter-in-law. And if my mother-in-law raised objections, I would divert her attention, even forcibly if necessary. I tried to guide my husband, who obediently followed my in-laws' orders, to minimize the damage as much as possible when he tried to mess up the workplace. It seemed that the employees noticed my efforts. Unexpectedly, I realized that they held affection for me. It was the smiles of my son John and those employees that helped me get through those tough days.
If Elizabeth isn't here, they say there's no reason to work here. Who do they think is paying their salaries?
I couldn't help but burst out laughing at my husband's frustrated voice. Who on earth said such a thing? The faces of each employee flashed through my mind and then disappeared. It seemed my laughter caught their attention, as my in-laws glared at me with anger. Without hesitation, my husband spoke in a commanding tone.
Listen. Here are their phone numbers. Convince them to come back.
He thrust the phone book towards me, and I couldn't help but burst into laughter at the way he spoke, as if I would obediently comply. Ha ha ha. Why would I do that? I'm not your wife anymore, and I'm not an employee either. Besides, I haven't even been paid for the work I've done so far. Oh, how absurd. I wiped the tears from my eyes. What kind of tears are these? Are they tears of separation from the husband who used to be gentle? Listen, you haven't paid me just because we're family and you've been uncooperative with household chores and childcare. You've treated me like a maid. I have no reason to listen to what you say, and I have no intention of returning there. Furthermore, I have absolutely no intention of persuading the employees, not even a bit. After laughing for a while, I quietly spoke up. Perhaps neither my husband nor my in-laws had anticipated me countering so strongly, as they all fell silent. For the past 15 years, I've endured everything for the sake of my son. No matter how much malice was directed towards me, no matter how much my dignity was disregarded, I endured it all for the sake of my son. In their eyes, perhaps I appeared as the quiet, submissive daughter-in-law, one who wouldn't dare defy them. As I conveyed my message decisively, they alike gaped like goldfish, unable to respond. I've also made up my mind. I'll be claiming the unpaid wages. If the employees have quit, then me claiming won't harm them. I was ready to leave without causing trouble for the remaining employees, but if they're the ones who'll suffer, it's a different story. I declare firmly, ignoring my husband's surprise, and turn on my heel. I could hear voices trying to stop me, but I fled with all my might. Upon returning home, I immediately asked a lawyer acquaintance of my father to contact me, and after explaining the situation so far, I decided to file a lawsuit for unpaid wages. The diary I had diligently kept proved to be useful, as it provided evidence of the dates and times I worked, as well as the words spoken by my husband and in-laws each day, which were presented as compelling evidence. Furthermore, one of the employees had recorded conversations when he witnessed me being harassed by them. He even went out of their way to find and bring the recordings to my parents' house, which proved to be invaluable for my divorce proceedings. Thanks to them, I gained a significant advantage, allowing me to claim some of the compensation I was supposed to receive, along with damages for the years of suffering, from my former in-laws, excluding the part that had already exceeded the statute of limitations. My in-laws and husband stormed into my parents' house, but they quieted down and left when my father called the police. Later, the amount we won was deposited into the designated account. The factory owned by my in-laws, which lost employees in an instant, couldn't possibly operate with just my father-in-law and husband, so it closed down immediately. It seems that they depleted their savings by paying me for damages, compensation, and the severance pay of the resigned employees. They have apparently sold off their house, land, and everything else, and are now living in a small apartment. I heard that my husband, along with my in-laws who were joint guarantors, had to work part-time despite their old age to cover the penalty fees owed to the company they had contracted with. It seems they are doing physically demanding jobs to earn even a little income. As for my husband, it seems he has started job hunting, but he has only ever worked in his family's factory and apparently lacks any general social awareness. He was spoiled and raised as the heir apparent since childhood, so when he faced criticism from a younger superior right after getting a job, he couldn't handle it. Since then, he hasn't been able to secure a decent job and seems to be relying on his parents for a living, according to what the lawyer who visited my in-laws informed me. I had been taking a break at my parents' house with my son John for a while, but I managed to find a new job thanks to connections from my previous employment. So, my son and I started living in an apartment near the company. My parents said I could commute from their place, but I didn't want to rely on them indefinitely, considering their old age. I discussed it with my son, and we decided it was best to be independent. Of course, I try to visit them whenever I have free time to make up for the 15 years we couldn't see each other. Furthermore, I ended up reconnecting with the former employee who had recorded the harassment from my in-laws at my new workplace. When I saw him and called out, we both seemed surprised and relieved, laughing together in relief. He had always shown concern for me at the in-laws' factory, and it didn't take long for him, with whom I had a harmonious working relationship, to propose to me. When John, who sensitively noticed my change, questioned me and I confessed about it, he ended up getting angry, asking me why I didn't tell him sooner. It seemed John remembered him well and quickly grew fond of him. Despite the challenges posed by my former in-laws, John must have had his own thoughts and feelings about his blood-related father and grandparents. However, those concerns quickly vanished when I saw John and my new husband bonding while happily building model kits together. "All right, time for dinner, you two," I called out as I served freshly made meat spaghetti. Both at work and at home, I feel an overwhelming sense of happiness. It's almost scary how happy I am. Those difficult days were perhaps meant to lead to the happiness we have today. I'm sure the day when the three of us laugh off those tough times together isn't too far away.